Hey there, gang. Let's go back to the movies. So it's been a little while. I've been wanting to talk about movies I really like, certain characters and stuff like that. And I wanted to talk about my favorite movie franchise of all time, probably. And it's kind of a quantity over quality basis because there are seven freaking movies in this franchise. But let me roll back and just talk about how I first came upon it. And then we'll talk a little bit about the movies themselves. I actually first discovered this first installment of this franchise shortly after I graduated. I was kind of in a shitty headspace because, you first graduate, then you're living with your folks, and then you have no money. You're like, what the hell am I supposed to be doing? So I was sitting there with my mom. We were parsing through a whole bunch of horror movies that we've never seen before because my mom, of all people, introduced me to horror movies and introduced me to some of the biggest scares of my life until, of course, I got more and more desensitized as I grew up, and now nothing scares me except death and taxes. But as we were going through these movies, we found one hidden gem which absolutely blew me away, and it is called VHS. To be more precise, not VHS like any old VHS tape, like an actual movie franchise called VHS, so V/H/S. That's what it's called. And I wanted to shed some more light on this franchise because it's very niche, but for the few people who know it, they are pretty diehard. It's got a really strong cult following, especially since they're turning out movies to this day on a yearly basis. It's pretty impressive. So what is VHS? It's effectively a horror franchise that began during the early 2010s found footage craze. So for example, you had movies like Paranormal Activity, Cloverfield, Wreck, a whole bunch of others. If you know any movies like that and you come to enjoy them, then VHS is definitely going to be your cup of tea. If you're not used to the found footage format, where you're effectively in the POV of certain characters in a story, then VHS might not be for you. But if you're at all enticed, I encourage you to watch on. So as we're recording in early 2025, there are currently 7 movies in this franchise, which is pretty nuts. So it's blocked out basically like this. There's the original trilogy, so you got VHS, the OG, then you got 2 and Viral, which is the third one. And then you had another trilogy which came sometime after that, which was which were all Shudder exclusives, and you can still find them now. They are what I call the Years trilogy because they're titled as follows: VHS 94, 99, and 85. So each one takes place within a specific year, which is pretty ingenious if you ask me, especially since we're, well, using the VHS format, which serves some movies better than it does others in this franchise. And the last one is kind of just like a hangnail, like kind of an afterthought right now, because it's meant to sort of jettison a new genre within this series. And it's called VHS Beyond, which is like its own kind of standalone sci-fi version of it. So it looks like that's the direction they're going in. They're moving away from the years format, and now they're focusing specifically on a genre. So that's kind of cool. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can twist and turn this format to embody certain tones and themes and tropes that we see throughout horror, pretty much. It's also worth mentioning, well, very important that I mention that these movies are not so straightforward. They're not linear. They're not a single story with a beginning, middle, and end. They are anthology movies. If you don't know what those are, they're effectively movies which are a collection of individual stories, as opposed to just one giant story being told over the span of 1.5 to 2 hours. They always have segments. And that's a fascinating thing. Each segment is directed by a different person. They have a unique crew. So it's almost like a roulette wheel. You never know what you're going to get. Every segment is unique. Everybody has their favorite segments. Everyone has their favorite movies. So with that respect, it's kind of impossible to say which movie is the best, which segments are the best. I mean, there's certainly some that are way up there and some that are way down there, but that's a really cool thing. Everyone's got their own perspective on what is the highlights within this franchise. And there are breaks in between these segments, which are really interesting, which are called the frameworks. Everyone calls them something different. And they're basically overarching stories that occur that resume playing between each segment to kind of sort of tie the segments together. Usually it's kind of 50-50. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I don't really think about or care about those as much. But those are there, and that's what ties the film together. They're the glue, effectively. So, still very important. And if they're done very poorly, they can affect the rest of the entire movie, because, again, it occurs between and after every single segment. So with this franchise being I think a decade old, maybe older at this point, and with more movies to see in the future. Why am I creating this video? Firstly, I've made videos on this before on my other YouTube channel, Player Display, but I wanted to kind of do a refresher because there has been an additional movie since that video, so I want to do a little bit of an update. But this particular video, it's not just going to be a ranking or anything like that. It's more so going to be just an introduction into the franchise for any of you who are curious. And I'm going to be doing an overview of each movie and kind of talking about my favorite segments. Spoiler free. I think this is definitely a franchise where you do not want to be spoiled. The surprises are the things that matter most. And I'm also going to be recommending a watch order because it's one of those unique horror franchises where you don't need to be intimidated with any lore or movies that happened in the past. There's no giant overarching story happening here. So you can kind of start wherever you want, but based on your mileage, how much violence you can take, and things of that nature, there are certain places where I recommend you begin, and certain movies that you can end on later on when you're a little bit more toughened up, and other ones I think you should just avoid completely. Well, rather one. We'll get there when we do. But anyways, let's begin with VHS 1. I got a whole bunch of crib notes here to keep me going here. VHS, in my opinion, it's the best of all of them. I feel like it's most consistent. I feel like it's the most tonally grounded. I feel like all of them, again, they're all the segments are separate stories, but I feel like all of them do have a tangible theme that links them together more successfully than all the other films in this franchise. However, that being said, this movie, again, we're talking early 2010s, so there wasn't a whole lot of sensitivity and woke culture, so this one, it's got no restraint at all. I mean, it's worth mentioning these movies are produced by a company called Bloody Disgusting. That means these movies are typically bloody and disgusting, and this one has it in spades. It's one of the most difficult movies to watch if you have issues with blood, which I don't. The one area where I do have a little bit of a problem with this movie is it does get a little distasteful, to put it lightly, in the way that they treat the female characters. I'm not going to go any further than that. I mean, when I watch a movie, I'm kind of like, oh shit, that happened, and I'm kind of able to ignore it and just appreciate the good parts of the movies. But if this is something that's a problem for you, again, this is where I mentioned you don't have to feel obligated to watch these movies in order. You don't even have to feel obligated to watch the first one. It's a very strong and rancid entry into this franchise, so it's one of those ones that you can pass on and go to one of the safer ones. But that being said, the stories it tells are extremely strong. I mean, the one it opens with is actually my favorite in the entire franchise, being Amateur Night. A lot of people discredit this one because it is inherently the first one, and it sets a standard for what a VHS segment is supposed to be. But basically, you got a whole bunch of guys, like, kind of just hanging out in a motel room, and they go out clubbing, or not really clubbing, just go to a bar, and go out to pick up some woman. Then they get them drunk, and they bring them back to their apartment, and you kind of have an idea of where this is going. But it has a happy ending, I'll say that much. But I will have to get slightly spoilery in saying that these segments aren't totally grounded, and that while they do use the found footage format, they're not afraid to bring in supernatural, create new monsters, even robots at times. So it gets really bonkers, and sometimes it does exactly the opposite of what you're expecting to happen, and it makes it all the more satisfying because of it. So Amateur Night is one of those segments that definitely does that tenfold. But on the other hand, sometimes this franchise can get really grounded. Another segment in VHS 1 is Second Honeymoon, where you have none of those crazy supernatural, otherworldly elements whatsoever. Instead, it's just about a married couple that is just going to vacation to the Grand Canyon or something like that around there. And they're staying in, again, a hotel room. I don't know why that's a theme. But every night, this is why the found footage genre is so unique. You see the perspective of a stranger who goes into their apartment and messes around with their belongings. And it's really creepy. And the ending is also not what you're expecting. Like if you're a sucker for like Shyamalan level plot twists, these movies are excellent. So that's another big note that I'd want to mention. Now let's move on to VHS 2, and this is widely considered to be the best of all the VHS movies. Personally, I don't quite agree with that sentiment because I feel like the segments are very inconsistent. Some are really great, some are just okay. None of them are terrible, though, I suppose. But I think the reason why people appraise this one so much is because there's one segment in this movie that is so goddamn good. But before I get into that, I think one of the really important things that this movie does do is it helps to establish the VHS brand by kind of reflecting on VHS 1 a little bit, and while keeping the gore, it rolls back on the more distasteful themes I talked about before. So after VHS 1, those kind of dissolve. They're not as bad. So that dials down, which I do appreciate as a viewer. Like, I don't mind having those things in movies, but at the same time, I'm like, is it needed? Like when we were talking about Nosferatu 2024 in a review that we did lately, it's like, do we need certain transgressive elements in these movies to get the point across? But yeah, VHS 2, it kind of stays away from them, but it focuses more on what made the first one so great, being the gore, the really creative, innovative storytelling, the bonkers plot twists and all of that, bringing in otherworldly elements. It does that in spades. It does such a good job. So first favorite of mine is A Ride in the Park. It's POV zombies. You're literally taking the perspective of somebody who has become a zombie, and previously they had a headcam strapped to their helmet when they were biking. So they're running around as a zombie, and you are the zombie, and it's really cool. It feels extremely Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead, I could liken it to. Also very George A. Romero as well. So yeah, again, every segment can dip into any genre. So just the fact that this one is zombies, and the previous one I talked about being Second Honeymoon is just people, that gives you an idea of the sheer diversity that you experience in these segments. Now, the big one, the piece de resistance within this franchise, is Safe Haven. This is what just about everyone across the board, across all the videos I've watched, all the reviews I've read, this is the one that everyone says is the best of all of them. And I'm not taking anything away from them. It is really damn good. It's basically about a group of people who are in, I don't remember if it's Malaysia or South Korea, but that's another cool thing about this franchise. Sometimes you have multilingual segments, which is really awesome and very much appreciated. Again, to add more of that diversity in there. But basically, this group of journalists, college students even, they're going to investigate this very Jonestown-like cult, where it's just this temple, and everything that goes on in the temple takes place in a basement, and there are a lot of strange happenings. It's a very slow burn. There's some really disgusting implied elements. This one also dips into the supernatural a little bit, which is also always fun. But this is one of those ones where I feel like it goes a little too big. It flies a little too close to the sun. I prefer the ones that are more grounded most oftentimes, but this one's so great. It's like 5-star segment easily. So yeah, if there's a single segment I say you should absolutely look forward to it and pay attention to it when it does come up in your marathon, Safe Haven and VHS 2 has got to be that segment. Now, we move on to VHS 3, which is VHS Viral. So, are you familiar with the trend of a trilogy where the first one is highly respected, the second one is considered to be a lot better than the one that came before, then you get the third one, which you don't know what happened, but it just feels totally out of touch. This is that movie, and everyone across the board agrees it's the worst VHS movie that there is. It is thematically broken. I mean, it's in the title. I mean, there's so many issues with this movie, but just the title makes no sense. VHS Viral. How can a VHS tape go viral? Like, I guess you could, if you have the right tech, you could upload it to the internet and make it more widespread, which is kind of part of the framework. But the framework, though, not only does it make no sense, it's also one of the worst directed things that I've ever seen in my entire life. Just a sheer breakneck pace that's going at, and people are just dropping dead left and right for no apparent reason. It's awful. It makes it so bad. It takes away the any merit that the segments in between would have otherwise had. And there's only 3 segments in this movie. It's the bare minimum. It's the smallest amount of segments in all these movies, when usually there would be like 4 or 5, maybe 6. And so this one really shortchanges you. And honestly, it just feels like a bootleg VHS movie. It feels like a movie trying to riff off the original success of the first 2 movies. It doesn't feel like it's an actual like VHS movie in DNA. It feels totally out of place. It doesn't feel like it belongs whatsoever. That being said, the segments are they're fine. I don't like watching them, but objectively they're serviceable enough. I mean, there's one called Dante the Great, which is kind of like, that's the thing. It's got a good premise where basically you have like a penniless magician who discovers this magical cape belonging to Harry Houdini and all that. But the really weird thing about it that takes you totally out of that element is it's filmed documentary style, which sounds intriguing enough. But again, it's a franchise called VHS. Why would this segment be in documentary style? It doesn't add up, you know what I mean? So, and that can be said for a lot of other segments throughout this franchise where it just doesn't make sense how it'd be a VHS tape. How would someone else be able to obtain this tape to add it to the collection of other tapes within that movie? So that kind of takes you out of it. But this one especially just feels totally off. There's another segment, and I guess if you had to twist my arm, it's my favorite segment in the movie, but even then I don't love it. It's called Parallel Monsters, another multilingual one, this time Spanish, where a guy creates a portal into a parallel universe. He meets his doppelganger, kind of, and they basically agree, let's spend 5 minutes within each other's universe. And I won't go any further than that. I mean, even though this movie is the crap de la crap of the franchise, I do want to not go into spoilers here. But it is an interesting enough one, but it bites off way more than it can chew, which is a much more funny thing to say when you know the actual context of Parallel Monsters. But yeah, this movie is the most skippable of all of them, and it's egregious on the eyes. It's not visually pleasing at all. Not just in terms of the content, but it's just bad. It's not a good film overall. Like, it can't be saved by any like pinnacle moments in there. It's just bad. Now, due to the raving success of VHS Viral, the franchise would remain dormant for a certain amount of time. I'm not totally sure how long, but at least until the advent of Shudder. If you don't know what Shudder is, it's basically a streaming service for crazy people, for folks who like horror movies and all the like. And I guess they teamed up with Bloody Disgusting, and they started churning out Shudder original VHS movies. And, you know, at first you'd think, oh no, it's gonna bog it down, it's gonna sanitize the franchise, or something like that. Actually, no, they kind of found a way to give this franchise a second life. They really did resurrect it by, again, kind of toning down the more violent elements, making them a little bit more clean for modern perceptions, so they're more accessible in that way, and I think that's overall a good thing. But they're still really gritty and disgusting and bloody disgusting, don't get me wrong. So, again, this starts the Years trilogy. The first one being VHS 94, or 1994, obviously. So this brought the franchise back from the dead, effectively. And this one has a pretty strong following. Of all the movies, a lot of people cite this as one of their personal favorites. For me, yeah, but at the end it kind of loses me. But it has some really excellent entries. I mean, it opens up with one segment called Storm Drain, where you have a news reporter who's going into the sewer system to investigate this almost Pennywise-like cryptid creature that the town has been discussing about. It's kind of Blair Witch in that way, where you hear this urban legend of this monster in a small town, and then you go out to investigate it. Very ill-advised, and very crazy stuff happens after that. But as much as I love that segment, a segment I love even more, and my favorite in this entire movie, is Empty Wake. Now, this is kind of like Second Honeymoon from VHS 1, where it's very quiet, very minimalistic. It takes it doesn't take too many liberties with the cameras. The cameras are actually fixed where they are. It takes place in a funeral home at night where a woman is hosting her very first wake, and there's nobody there. All there is her, a few fixed cameras for whatever reason we don't know, and a coffin with a stiff in it. And that's all we know. And then there's a storm, and there's weird happenings like flickering of lights, you name it. And the ending is so good. It's an excellent drum roll. I love it so much. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. A lot, so like some segments fall back on shock value. Some of them are just blatant horror, and there are other ones that are just really suspenseful and gut wrenching. And this is easily one of them. Doesn't need a lot of blood. In fact, there's barely any blood at all. But it's a really strong segment. In my opinion, it's like top five. It's a really good one. Sorely underrated. But again, like we were talking about segments that fly a little too close to the sun, but are so very good. That brings us to another segment in '94 called The Subject, where you take the point of view of a cyborg. And this is another international one. I believe this one is South Korean, which is really cool. And this is another very successful segment. And that one's so bonkers crazy, I won't even talk anymore about it, but that is also a huge standout. A lot of people put that on par with Safe Haven for good reason. I don't know, South Korea, they just know what they're doing. And that takes us to the middle entry of the second trilogy, being VHS 99. I was born in 99. So this movie is actually the most nostalgic for me. It allows me to reflect on an era that I just missed. So this one's really special to me, and it might be my favorite. I say that with loose terms because again, it's hard to say what your favorite VHS movie is because all of them have good segments, all of them have just okay segments, and some have ones that are just outright terrible. In the case of Viral, it's consistently terrible. But this one has some really excellent segments in it. I feel like it's pretty underrated. I think because it has a more upbeat tone to it. It's a little bit more fun, not quite as daunting and harrowing as other movies that we talked about in the franchise. But it does have one of my favorite, like maybe top 3 segments in there called Shredding, which a lot of people hate. But again, it's a roulette wheel. Some people are going to love these segments, some people are going to hate them. This one's about this amateur punk rock band who try investigating the death site of another punk rock band, where they like burn to death in a club. And one thing I really want to mention is this franchise. This is a totally out of left field thing to start talking about, but this franchise, every blue moon, it has its own original songs or tracks. And Shredding has a really good one. It's spoiler free. It's called Diamonds Turn Black by Bitch Cat. It's a really great song by a fake band, but it's so cool. And again, feeding into that 99 nostalgia, it's just awesome to hear a punk song that's so of that era. And it's great. I love when these segments make their own original songs to get you in the mood. And again, if you're okay with a fun horror movie, 99 is probably the place for you. Another really good one is Ozzy's Dungeon, another really big fan favorite. This one takes place in a very, well, 90s, of course, Nickelodeon-style kids game show sort of thing, where, you know, the kids are doing parkour, they're going through obstacle courses, but things are not quite as they seem, and you start learning that later on. And there's this really odd batshit mythos behind this particular game show and the way it operates, why it exists. So that's a really enticing one. And I'm kind of being hypocritical when I bring up this third one within 99. I usually say I like it when things are more grounded, when things are more down to earth. But I guess I make an exception for this one because it's below earth. This one is called To Hell and Back. You are literally in hell with like 2 college bros and they're trying to escape, and it's so goddamn fun, especially with like all the practical makeup and things like that. There's all these creatures and traps. It's so fun. Actually, this is the movie that I introduced my friend First Order Films to. I mentioned her on my channels several times before, but this is the movie I used to introduce her to the franchise, and To Hell and Back is her favorite. So, I don't know, it's interesting. It depends on what movie you start with, what segments you're first exposed to. I mean, totally, they're all so unique, and all of them bring something unique to the table. Sometimes not great, but more than often, they're awesome, and they're a wild time. That takes us to VHS 85, which was actually the first VHS movie I was there to see premiere on Shudder, which is a really special moment. And this one makes the most sense of all the movies. I mean, if you want to talk VHS, go to the friggin' 80s, man. I mean, if you just want random, like, spooky VHS tapes floating around for people to recover, this is probably the right decade to be doing that. So, of all the movies in these seven, this one makes the most sense to that theme. And this one also does something that's really unique. Several things that are unique. The first thing being that two segments are part of the same story. They take place not back to back. There's one or two that happen in between them, but they're directly related, which is really cool. I've never seen them do that before. Some people were really thrilled with it. Some people were a little like, I don't want that. I prefer it be individual. And I get both perspectives, but for me, I thought it was unique and interesting, and it hadn't been done before or since. So I thought it was pretty cool. As for segments I did like, I mean, I think I liked all of them but one maybe. But for two that I really did enjoy or that are at least worth mentioning, the first one is No Wake. Not to be confused with Open Wake from '94. No Wake is about a group of there's a lot of college students in these movies, okay? But they go out on a boat ride out into a lake, and they, let's just say, when they go into the lake, they don't come out of the lake the same way. I'll leave it at that. Again, spoiler free. Next one I want to talk about is Dream Kill. This one's a really fascinating one because actually this is one of the hardest ones to watch, even for me, and I could take a lot. This one is extremely visceral, like VHS 1 levels of disgusting. But it's really well done, firstly. And it's from the killer's POV. You are the serial killer. And it's really hard to watch, but it's excellently done. And a little trivia behind this one, it actually has direct connection to The Black Phone. If you know that movie, I believe they're directed by the same guy, or there's some connection between there. So if you know the mythos of Black Phone, that translates directly into Dream Kill. They're canon with each other, which is really cool. And the last VHS movie to date, I actually just watched it this morning, is VHS Beyond, and this one is sci-fi themed. Again, moving away from the years format, which I'm personally good with. I don't know what other years they could poke and prod at. I mean, they did two in the 90s, they did one in the 80s. I feel like it would be redundant if they went any further with that. So for me, this was a refreshing change of pace, and honestly, I don't think there was a particular huge pinnacle standout from this movie. It's pretty base, but it might be the most accessible and consistent of all the movies. I think tonally, violence-wise, it's pretty streamlined, so take that for what you will, but I do think that makes it one of the most watchable of all the VHS movies. As for my favorites, actually, the first one I want to talk about is Stowaway, which is the last movie. The last segment in this movie. And the first time I watched it, I actually didn't like it much at all. I wasn't really too sure what to make of it. But upon rewatching it, I found it a lot more interesting. Again, it's a sci-fi movie. So this one is about this independent journalist who's kind of out in, I think, like Las Vegas or something, like in the desert, kind of just driving through the sands and stuff. And she's trying to find UFOs, effectively. The last thing I'll say is, if you want to talk fates worse than death, this has one of those, and it's really enticing. So definitely check that one out. And oddly enough, I know I just said this movie was the most consistent, but still it does have its areas where it kind of falls off that sci-fi thing. And that's with one other segment called Fur Babies, which is not sci-fi at all, but it's somehow my favorite one in VHS Beyond. And this one, if you're at all intrigued by not necessarily serial killers, but just the weirdest of the weirdos, like Ed Gein and those weird things that they do behind the scenes, like they put up this facade and then they're doing something really odd and depraved in the background. This is a segment for you. But this one takes place at a doggy daycare. Would you believe it? So it's a fascinating one, but once more, don't want to do spoilers. They're probably spoiled enough already, so I apologize for that. But Yeah, you can't go wrong with any of these movies at the end of the day, except for Viral, obviously, for reasons I've explained already. So to wrap up here, I want to go over what is the proper order in which to watch these movies, because like I said, the order you watch them in doesn't really matter, because none of them have anything to do with each other except for the fact that they all follow the same basic format, being that they're segments, then the wraparound stories and all that, the frameworks, whatever you want to call them. But that being said, it's really your pick. You can start with any movie you want, but personally, I I would recommend watching them in order of release, so that way you can get an idea of their evolution or de-evolution, depending on how you view it, what you prefer a VHS movie to be. But if you want to play things a little safer and you're a little concerned with the gore and the more sensitive material, I kind of created this alternate watch order that might be a little better for the uninitiated. So here's the way I set it up. I typed it up here. So it's basically in three categories. First category is Beyond and 99. These are the most inoffensive ones. These are the safest, the least bloody. I mean, they're all bloody. I mean, it's in the DNA of the VHS franchise. You're going to get gore no matter what movie you go with. But they're largely, these two, Beyond and 99, are largely inoffensive, and they're a lot more fun. They're a lot more bubbly, not too suspenseful, not too serious. They're very doable, very watchable. Like, I think 99 is the one that I have watched the most out of all these movies. Even though I wouldn't consider it to be necessarily the best objectively, that trophy would probably go to VHS 1. Next category we have here is 2 and 94. And these ones are, I believe, the more consistent entries in the franchise. Overall, again, they're all kind of up and down tonally, genre-wise. I mean, that's kind of in the nature of an anthology series. But they all have some really good surprises in them. Absolutely. Some of the best moments in the franchise, like if you're talking in a circle of people who like the VHS movies, they're probably going to be referring to 2 and 94 the most. So these are probably the more seminal movies in the franchise, I'd say. Last, third, and final category, if you want things to get a little spicy, things to get a little bit vulgar, visceral, you're not afraid, you can handle it all, then do 1 and 85. I think that's the way to go. 1, again, as I said, it's the most hard to watch of all of them, thematically and in terms of blood and violence. As for 85, I wouldn't quite bucket it in that category if it weren't for Dream Kill, which I say is equivalent to VHS 1. So both of them are kind of on the same pedestal, in my opinion. And both of them deal with some of the most difficult themes of all the movies in here. So if you can handle anything, and you know horror, and how deep it can go, then tackle 1 in 85. But wait a minute, you notice how I haven't mentioned 3? Yeah, you could totally skip it. You don't have to watch it at all. Seriously, it feels like a really shit fan fiction of this franchise. I don't even consider it to be a true VHS movie. At least all the other ones felt like they had genuine passion in them. But as for 3, to this day, I don't understand why it is so incongruent with the rest of the movies. It felt like there was no heart in it at all. It just felt like they wanted to crank out another movie. It felt so thoughtless. It's so poorly directed. The framework is atrocious, and the segments aren't memorable. And there's only 3 of them, so of all the movies, this is the one that you get the least from. And it might just piss you off if you love the franchise as much as I do. And that's a wrap for my little overview of VHS, revisiting it for a 3rd time now. Again, I've done 2 podcasts on my other channel, Player Display, if you want to check those out. Those are just ranking all the segments one by one, excluding, of course, Beyond, because that one came a little bit later. But I did want to revisit this franchise because it is very special to me. It came around during a really pivotal time in my life, and I enjoy watching all of them, except Viral, but we talked about that. And yeah, I just highly recommend it. It's such a buffet. That's the way I always describe it. You're gonna have things that you love about it, you're gonna have things that you hate about it, but ultimately, it's a really oddly a wholesome experience, and that you have all these different types of directors who want to add their own fingerprint within the VHS DNA, and it makes it all the more special because of that. It's a really unique franchise, and if you know anything about found footage films, or you know nothing about it at all, this might be a good place for you to start. So if you haven't tried it, and I hope I persuaded you to give it a shot, and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you're a veteran and you're an all-time VHS lover like me, then let me know what your favorite segments were. But still keep it spoiler-free for the sake of any newbies in the comments as well. So all that being said, thank you guys very much for watching, and enjoy your marathon.